there is another factor that we can't discount when we consider why the border has fallen quiet. Not because what I've covered already isn't enough to solve the mystery, but because it really exemplifies how immigration policy has arisen for decades from this power struggle between the executive, between the White House, basically, and the courts. This is glaringly apparent when we look at asylum. Now, asylum has had a political context for a very long time. It basically means that now that you're here, we'll protect you from whatever drove you here for as long as you're threatened by it. Both Trump and Biden made their attempts to restrict asylum, generally with the idea that asylum would be denied to immigrants who didn't have a compelling story about what drove them here, or who didn't think to apply for asylum in the countries that they passed through on their way here. I'm going to fly through the topic of asylum as fast as I can, just so that you can get sort of a full view of this ongoing gamesmanship that occurs when Congress sits on the sidelines. Now, it starts when Trump issued this executive order in his first few days in office, setting the stage for this DHS policy announcement November 9th, 2018, which basically denies asylum to anyone who didn't stand in line at a port of entry and enter the country in an orderly fashion. A federal district judge in San Francisco named John Tiger put a block on this asylum restriction. Tiger's order was reviewed by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and then by the Supreme Court, which let Tiger's order stand in December of 2018, thus preserving the institution of asylum. So Trump tried again, saying, okay, well, you at least need to apply for asylum in one of these other countries you just passed through first before you apply for asylum here. This policy landed on the desk of John Tiger again, who blocked it again, saying that the government had failed to show that these other countries are at all safe for asylum seekers. So no, we cannot expect that asylum seekers apply for asylum in these countries. A month later, on August 16th, 2019, the Ninth Circuit limited Tiger's injunction to California and Arizona, which is awkward because now suddenly it's easier to get asylum at some parts of our border than in others. Another month later, in September 2019, a divided Supreme Court said Trump could restrict asylum after all, nationwide, at least for the time being, until the case and other cases challenging the asylum restriction are fully and officially heard on the merits in the lower courts. On June 30th, 2020, a Trump-appointed judge named Kelly struck down Trump's asylum restriction, ruling that the administration didn't follow the notice and comment rules, which basically say that when you're making a policy change like this, you have to announce it and have public hearings about it first. A week later, on July 6, 2020, the Ninth Circuit Appeals Panel reviewed Judge Tiger's injunction from 2019 and officially affirmed it. So at this point, the issue could have been appealed back up to the Supreme Court, but that didn't happen before Biden won the election 4 months later. So at this point, with Biden in the White House, the Biden administration was going to make its own attempts to restrict asylum, but Biden never brought it to the Supreme Court. And one of the judges on that Ninth Circuit panel I mentioned before loudly criticized this, suggesting that Biden didn't want the Supreme Court to rule on asylum restrictions because the administration basically was afraid that the Supreme Court would uphold the restrictions so emphatically that a president's asylum restrictions could never be challenged again in the future. It could be that Biden wanted to restrict asylum temporarily, but didn't want to be the president that oversaw the weakening of asylum as an institution. But I'm just guessing. I have no idea. Fast forward to May of 2023, when Biden announced another temporary asylum restriction, packaged as a new rule, but reading pretty much like the other ones, where we would deny a migrant's asylum application if they didn't ask for asylum from other countries they traveled through first, plus they can't apply again for 5 years. Interestingly, the following month of June saw a sharp reduction in border encounters. arguably because of this new rule. But the month after that, on July 25th, 2023, this asylum restriction came before Judge Tiger, who blocked it on summary judgment, citing the same reasons as before, and surprising no one. But a week later, on August 2nd, 2023, the Ninth Circuit panel puts another stay order on Tiger's block order, which should have meant the Biden administration could restrict asylum claims. But whether it did or not, I'm not sure. In any case, border encounters went right back up well into 2024. So why wouldn't the Biden administration enforce its own restrictions that it had announced and drafted and published? I can only guess. Maybe it was to appease the civil rights activists that were challenging the asylum restrictions. If you appease the activists, then the Ninth Circuit doesn't get a chance to review the case on its merits, won't issue a ruling, in which case it won't be appealed to the Supreme Court, which, as I mentioned before, could strip away all the judicial case law that had been built up for decades around asylum that has protected it from presidents who have sought to undermine it as an institution of American principle, but I am just guessing. I do not know. It could be that all these lawyers were hoping to find a compromise so artfully worded that none of the justices of the Supreme Court would be inclined to interfere. The Supreme Court has tossed out some surprises recently, and it could be that politicians and activists alike are frozen with fear of the unknown. So they stalled. The Biden administration lawyers and the civil rights activists challenging the asylum restrictions went hand in hand to the Ninth Circuit and asked that the case be put on hold. And the Ninth Circuit said, okay. And so it remained until Trump took office. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. On June 4th, 2024, Biden issued a fresh proclamation restricting asylum and again repackaged, so any challenges to it would have to start from scratch in the lowest courts. The new restriction read a lot like the ones that came before it, with some differences. First, it only activates when the number of daily border encounters reaches a certain level, and then when the number of daily border encounters drops to a more manageable level, then the asylum restriction automatically disengages, so that asylum is reinstated. Migrants can ask for upon arrival. The message I'm getting from that is basically, if you're an individual in trouble, then you can come to America and ask for asylum, and we might help you out. But if your entire home region has been hit with some catastrophe, then the United States can't take you all in, or at least not under asylum policy. So the most important difference in Biden's June of 2024 asylum restriction is probably that prior to that, a Border Patrol officer was actually required to ask every migrant, are you afraid of something? Is something chasing you? Are you afraid to return home? And if the answer is yes, the officer is required to help you fill out, or at least prompt you to fill out an asylum application. Now, with Biden's newer rule in June of 2024, that's changed. Now the migrant has to voluntarily tell the officer about their fears all on their own, or else they are turned away. In other words, it's no longer in a Border Patrol officer's job description to make sure that a fearful migrant isn't sent back into the clutches of whatever it is they were running from. Before, we as a nation made it our business to make sure that a migrant who needs protection, who needs asylum, would get it. But now, if your need for protection is not noticeable, you're probably going to escape notice. Biden's restriction on asylum took effect and remained in effect for the next 6 months until the end of his term. And during that time, border encounters plummeted to levels lower than Biden had seen during the Biden years. But, of course, as we know, this was not enough to score Democrats enough points with the voters to prevent the return of Donald Trump to the White House. So, as we've seen, The courts can interpret the laws, they have that authority, and they can strike down the policies of whoever's in the White House. But then the president can tweak those policies and reissue those policies and enforce them until the courts have a chance to review them again. And this dance continues round and round until the Supreme Court has a chance to look at it, at which point we might get more surprises. But folks, it's Congress that's supposed to be writing these laws to begin with. Congress can settle issues like asylum for good. Not to mention President Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. But Congress hasn't passed any significant legislation to reform immigration for decades. They've changed the budgets, they've assigned some money, but the underlying rules have remained the same. And so the nation looks to one man to sweep into the White House and rattle the government framework with demands and threats. And so now that he appears to have successfully frightened off the immigrants of the world, half the country is thrilled with him. They're not concerned about the court orders that have been ignored. They're faithful that all the men in this El Salvadorian supermax get what they deserve. And they're ready to imbue the president with even more authority, maybe even a third term, or fourth term, as he might call it. Back in 2024, House Speaker Mike Johnson wrote, President Biden falsely claimed yesterday he needs Congress to pass a new law to allow him to close the southern border, but he knows that is untrue. Maybe Johnson's right. And Biden did know that it can be done with executive orders. But Biden seemed to think that it would be better for Congress to light the way. What do you think?